REKLAW RIA fantasy novel written by Melody Rogers Stegaheis, read by Melody Rogers Stegaheis. Chapters 4 through 6. Chapter 4. Let's Ride. Talon's warning came too late, but he knew he had to do something. Scooping up the hanky, he flew headlong straight into the village. Swooping and shrieking at anyone outside, he tried to tell them what had happened, but no one would listen. Everyone just shooed him away. Mr. Oakley actually threw a horseshoe at him when he swooped into the shop to get his attention, and Mrs. Anderson screamed as if the sky was falling when he landed on her porch rail. Mr. Ottoman tried to feed him a piece of jerky, thinking he just might be hungry. Finally, realizing he would get no help from the people in town, he headed straight for home. Colin was setting up the last of the tables and benches when Talon burst from the tree, shrieking louder than he had ever heard. The bird swooped over his head and dropped a bit of cloth on the table in front of him. Colin picked up the material and noticed Drianna's name. Without hesitation, he yelled for Belle and headed down the path towards the village. Belle ran from the house and followed him. When she caught up with him, he handed her the hanky without a word. Belle's only response at seeing the name and hearing Talon's loud shrieks was to gasp and to pick up speed. When they reached the village, Colin frantically asked everyone if they had seen Drianna. After many answers of, "She was just here," "Is there something wrong?" They had quite a following by the time they reached Miss Cora's place. The old woman stepped out of the inn and asked, "What on earth?" Colin interrupted her to ask if she had seen Drianna. Miss Cora noticed the white cloth Belle was wringing in her hands. She gently took it from her. The old woman nearly swooned as she recognized the hanky. "I gave this to your young lady only a short while ago. How did you—" Miss Cora's voice trailed off as Talon's shrieks became more urgent. Her rosy cheeks lost all color as she realized something was dreadfully wrong. "She said she was going to the meadow," Miss Cora said, and headed in that direction. The people in town followed Colin, his wife, and Miss Cora into the meadow. An eerie silence fell over the crowd as what happened opened up before them. The basket lay on its side in the middle of the meadow. The flowers and meadow grasses were bent and broken as if by powerful force. But it was the smell that truly told the story. A pungent stench hung on the air, filling Colin's nostrils as he dropped to his knees with a sob. Belle fainted into Mr. Anderson's arms, and his wife frantically fanned her face with her apron. Their 3 daughters shook with fear and cried into their mother's skirts. The youngest, Eva, asked, "Where's Mystery, Mama?" Mrs. Parsons let out a panicked cry and knelt to gather her children to her, hiding their faces from the scene. The men scanned the sky in silent fear. The Beckwith's child, their darling Drianna, had been taken by the most wretched creature known to man, a dragon. Everyone in the village had heard of Kansora, the last known dragon to live in these parts of the world. She was the curse for which the mountains were named. The stories of her wickedness and evil were well known, even to the smallest child. Everyone standing there at the edge of the meadow was struck utterly dumb with fear. Amos Oakley was the first to truly react. Turning back toward the village, he raced to his shop and the bell mounted on the pole beside his house. Ringing it long and loud, he sent the signal for a town meeting. Within half an hour, everyone within hearing distance of the bell was gathered in the town square. Raising his massive arms and clearing his throat, Amos called for silence. As the talk quieted, Colin and Belle stepped forward and faced their friends and neighbors. Colin had to clear his throat several times before he could speak. The look of fear and anguish on his face sent small waves of chatter through the crowd. Adriana has been taken, was all Colin could say before a sob broke through his words. Amos placed a huge hand on Colin's shoulder to comfort him and spoke loud and clear. This man's young granddaughter has been taken by Kansora. The mere mention of the name sent fearful cries through the crowd. Amos raised his hands once more and continues. There was no blood or signs of a struggle, so we presume that the girl was taken alive. We must track the beast and bring the young lass home. Do we have any here brave enough to take on the challenge? She bellowed into the crowd. Otto Cash was the first to step forward, loudly stating that he would kill the beast with his bare hands, and began to strut around challenging anyone to say he couldn't do it. Marvin Oley stepped up next, Tosh right behind him. They looked at each other and then at their father, who nodded proudly at his sons. Together they said, "We will go." 12-year-old Mason Carpenter started to move forward when his father's hand on his shoulder stopped him. "You need to grow a bit older, son, before you can take on a trip like this," he said gently. "Besides, I need you here for the capping." His mother stood nearby, holding his 2-year-old sister Tilana. She looked into his heartbroken face and said, "I am so proud of you, Mason, for being so brave." Tilly leaned forward and said, "I'm proud of Mason too, Mama. He'd be big brother." Mason could only smile and take Tilly into his arms for hugs and kisses only a 2-year-old could give. A smile from the back caused the crowd to part down the middle. A slim, well-built young man made his way to the front, his piercing blue eyes looking straight ahead. Loretta Anderson hid a giggle and a blush behind her hand. Her mother gave her a little nudge and a scolding look, but even Mrs. Anderson's cheeks flushed just a little as he walked by. Pushing his shoulder-length black hair back away from his face, he looked directly at Colin and Belle. "I will surely go," Devlin Thomas said, "but I must have assurances that my mother will be taken care of," looking back at the tiny woman who stood a few feet back from the crowd. "Hell's bells, boy, of course we'll look after your ma," Peg Cash said, stepping forward toward the young man. "You go and you bring that little lass back to her ma and pa. You and my boy and the other two. You bring her home. You hear?" Within a few hours, the boys were ready to go. Mr. and Mrs. Anderson provided all the provisions they would need and a sturdy new set of clothes for each of them. Mr. Ottoman gave each boy a horse from the livery. Devlin was given the young filly, to which the old man had given the name Wind Dancer. Mr. Ottoman had to laugh because she reacted to the boy like every other female in town, nickering happily and nuzzling his neck and cheek. The Oley boys were given the prancing pair of males. Thunderbolt and Lightning gave them quite a show as they with their high-stepping and head-bobbing. The boys had grins from ear to ear as they looked at the horses, then at each other. Because of Otto Cash's large size, he was given a large gray gelding, aptly named Mountain. The horse stood several inches taller than Otto, and although he would never admit it, mountain's immense size intimidated him. Just a little. Mr. Oakley disappeared into his house and reappeared with 4 swords, hand-picked from his collection. He had collected them from as far north as the mountains and from places beyond the southern forest. Each weapon was given the finest quality and selected by Oakley to fit each young man perfectly. Otto swung a double-edged broadsword around, trying desperately to show he actually knew how to use it. Marvin let out an exciting little whoop and did a few parry thrust moves with the short sword had been given, while Tosh just stared with eyes-popping awe at a similar one he held. Devlin quietly tested the balance and the feel of the beautifully crafted saber Mr. Oakley handed him. With a nod of approval, he thanked the man and strapped the sword to his narrow hip. Thought of actually having to use such a weapon weighed heavily on his mind. With provision packed and everything at the ready, each boy shook hands with Colin Beckwith and nodded their salute to his wife. All except Devlin Thomas, who, after shaking hands with Colin, took Belle's hand and looked directly into her wet, red-rimmed eyes. He said, "I will bring Brianna home to you, ma'am, or I will die trying." Somehow, looking into the boy's sincere blue eyes made Belle feel a sense of peace and a greater sense of hope. Devlin kissed the back of her hand, looked at Colin once more, and mounted Windancer. As the boys turned their mounts to leave, Colin said loudly, "Follow the hawk, boys. He is Brianna's best friend. He will lead you to her." A piercing scream came from high above as Talon soared away in a northerly direction. Amid the cheers and farewells, the boys kicked their mounts into action and rode away, following the second scream. Colin and Belle watched their departure long after they were out of sight. All hopes of Brianna's return lay on their brave shoulders. "They're so young," Belle said, almost under her breath. Colin wrapped his arm around her and gave a gentle squeeze. "Yes, but they're all strong. They will bring our girl home, my love." As Colin spoke the words aloud, all the doubt he had left him. He knew in his soul that Brianna would come home. Belle and Colin were not the only people still watching the road at that moment. Mary and Thomas stood a few feet away, holding a hanky under her quivering lip. One couldn't help but take pity on her. Peg Cash gently put her arm around her and began to lead her away. "You poor thing. You must come stay with Tom and me. We can worry about our boys together." Marion began to feebly protest, saying something about her farm. "Nonsense, dear. Tom and the other men will take care of your farm for you." Marion realized there was no use arguing and allowed Peg to lead her away. The Ole slowly approached Colin and Belle. Augustus Ole, or Gus as folks called him, placed his hand on Colin's shoulder and said, "Our boys are strong and brave. They will bring your girl home." He said it in such a matter-of-fact way that Colin couldn't help but raise his hand to Gus's shoulder and say, "I know, my friend, I know." Catherine Ole smiled at her husband's words and then turned to smile towards Colin and Belle. She was trying hard to keep the worry from showing on her face. Belle could see the turmoil in the other woman's eyes and gave her a gentle hug, saying, "They'll be all right," in her ear. The women smiled softly at each other, then at their husbands. All 4 worried parents walked towards their home together, knowing that home would not mean the same until their children were again safe and sound. The people of Dolan returned to their homes with heads hung low, nothing would be the same again. Chapter 5. Where, oh where? My head hurts. Why? I'm cold. I feel sick. What's happening to me? Where am I? Why? The question slowly floated through Dree's mind, just out of reach. Fuzzy pictures flashed behind her closed eyes, a nightmare of darkness enveloping her, and then a dream of lightness and air, then darkness once more. The pictures flashed faster through her mind, and the nightmare became clearer. A scream pierced the air. She was awake. It took only a moment to realize that the nightmare was, oh, so very real. Dree sat up quickly, terror filling her and to her very core. She drew in a deep breath to scream again, but this time the putrid stench around filled her lungs and made her retch instead. Covering her mouth and nose with her sleeve, she drew her knees up to her chest. Tears filled her eyes as she slowly looked around, her body shaking uncontrollably. She sat in the middle of a large, dimly lit cave. What light there was seemed to filter through from an opening high above. Greenish-colored water trickled down the walls and ran in little streams over broken rocks. A horrid stench emanated from piles of bones with rotting maggot-ridden meat still hanging on them. Animal carcasses lay in mangled heaps everywhere, with the eyes of dead faces staring blankly at her. Flies buzzed around puddles of thick, disgusting sludge, while other insects scurried in and out and over piles of dirty muck. She could hear bats squabbling somewhere high above and the scurry of rats in the rocks around her. Dropping her head to her knees, Juliana began to sob bitterly. What had happened? How in the world had she gotten here? And most of all, why was she here? Was she about to die? I don't want to die. Someone, please, please help me. These thoughts pounded through her brain, and her sobs grew stronger. Stop that racket, a voice growled from somewhere above her head. Juliana's heart jumped into her throat, and her eyes bulged with terror. Who said that? She nearly screamed, craning her neck all around. So the stories are true, the voice said. There is one that understands. Dree saw movement in one corner as a shadow began to change shape. Clambering backwards to get away, she froze as a serpentine head brought a pair of large red eyes to within a few feet of her. Joanna couldn't move. She could not breathe. Her body refused to do anything but shake. Her mind refused to comprehend anything as she stared into those enormous red eyes. I am Kansora, human child. You are the one who understands, are you not? Dree was struck dumb as she watched a horrible large mouth full of dagger-sized teeth growl out the words. Answer me, or I shall make you my mid-morning snack, the mouth growled out at her, moving to within inches of her face. Joanna choked on the creature's rancid breath. Yes, was all she could manage to say. The creature moved its head back a bit and smiled a grotesque smile. So I have finally found the right one. You have no idea how many stupid human females I've had to deal with to find you, child, it said as it moved its head up toward the ceiling on its snake-like neck. What do you want with me? Juliana asked timidly, feeling a bit braver now the creature's head wasn't so close. I brought you here to serve me, little one. You are going to be my nanny, of sorts, the creature growled and smiled again. Come, I'll show you what I mean. As the creature moved from the shadows, Drianna gasped. Shafts of light from the opening above illuminated sections of red and black scales over an enormous body. A purple hue came from wings draped across its back. The creature lumbered past. Drianna could see the shine of lacquer black claws and the sword-sized spikes protruding from its long serpentine tail. It took a moment or two to fully grasp what this creature was, and when she did, she began to shake even harder. A dragon. She was in the cave of Kansora the dragon. The head snaked around toward her and growled, Come. Dree jumped and rapidly got to her feet. She stumbled through the muck and mire, trembling so hard she could hardly walk. She followed the creature through an opening on the far side of the cave. It turned out to be a tunnel that led to another large cave. This one was not as large as the first, nor was it as dirty. There was no dead things in this cave, no bones or muck or bad smell. Large rocks and stones were scattered around the dry walls, while the floor was covered with soft sand. There was a red glow to the room, and it was much warmer than it had been in the previous cave. As the dragon moved to the opposite side, Dree could see the reason. In the center of the cave was a pool of bubbling gold liquid. Fire burst from the bubbles as they broke the surface, causing light to dance across the walls. Drianna stood at the entrance of the room and watched as the dragon lowered her head into the pool and moved what looked like large stones around. Come, the dragon growled impatiently. Dree jumped and cautiously moved to the edge of the pool. These are my children, girl, and you are going to take care of them for me. That is why you were brought here. Do you understand? What Drianna had first thought were stones were actually 4 leathery eggs laying in the center of the pool. Why don't you care for them yourself? Drianna said before she could stop herself. The dragon's head snapped to within an inch of her face in an instant. Are you losing your fear of me already, human brat? It growled harshly. That will not do. Will not do at all. Drianna could only tremble as fear blocked her throat and nearly stopped her heart as the evil eyes looked her up and down. Saliva dripped from enormous teeth as the dragon pulled its head away and looked down at her from above. I will not hurt you, child, as long as you do as I say. You will follow my instructions to the letter, and you will not try to escape, because if you do, the dragon brought its head down once again to stare directly into Drianna's eyes. I will destroy your village and every puny human in it. Drianna choked back a sob, swallowing the terror that gripped her and slowly nodding her head. Now to answer your question, I may be female, but I detest children and anything to do with motherhood. We dragons are a dying breed, so I must do my part, but I will not be saddled with tending a nest. I have much better things to do with my time. Drianna's stomach lurched as she thought of what those things might be. You will turn the eggs 4 times a day and place stones in the liquid to keep it at a constant level, Chancellor growled. There was a shovel against the wall. Do you understand? Yes, was all Drianna could say. The dragon turned heavily and stalked off down the tunnel. The crunching of bones and the beating of heavy wings told Drianna she was on her own. She She didn't move for several minutes. Closing her eyes, she willed herself to wake up from the nightmare she knew was real. Looking down in her dress, she knew the happiness she had felt a short time ago was now the dream. I have to be strong, she said to herself. I will not let that monster hurt my family. Dree waited a few minutes longer as the beat of heavy wings disappeared into the distance. Looking down the dark tunnel, she straightened her shoulders and said in a determined whisper, if she can get out that way, so can I. She stumbled down the dark passageway until she reached the first cave. The stench took her breath away once again, but this time she was ready for it and didn't let herself get sick. Stepping carefully over the filth, Brianna made it over to the far side of the room and found that she could use the boulders as a natural stairway of sorts. Climbing to the top, she found herself at a large opening that looked out over a spectacular view of the mountains. A flat U-shaped ledge near 20 feet wide lay just outside. A feeling of utter joy overwhelmed her, and she ran through the opening into the bright light of day. Her joy was short-lived, however, as she realized that the sheer drop off the ledge was all that awaited her. Getting to a stop, Brianna dropped to her knees and let out a cry of total hopelessness that echoed through the mountain air. Several deep breaths later, she had composed herself enough to return the way she had come with a determined hope. She would find a different way out. She searched the walls of the first cave and found nothing but solid, slimy rock. Returning to the next cave, she desperately searched every nook and cranny. After about 15 minutes or so, she found a small opening behind a rather large boulder. It was very small and very dark. She would need some kind of light. But where? Returning quickly to the first cave, Dree steeled her nerves and began to search for pieces of hide and a large bone or stick to make a torch. Once she had what she needed, she ran back to the next cave and hopefully her way out. The passage was barely large enough to crouch through and smelled of damp, cool earth. After about 10 feet, it opened into a small cave. Dree was delighted to find a small waterfall cascading down from somewhere high above. The water fell into a pool at the bottom of the back wall. The cool, damp air felt so good that she squealed with joy and raced to the water's edge. Placing the torch in a safe place, Dree stripped down and jumped into the icy liquid. The water pounded over and around her, and for the moment she forgot the horrors of where she was. She took her time washing her hair and then her clothes, savoring the freshness she felt. Sitting at the edge of the pool sometime later, Dree scanned the walls of the small cave. Not a crack could be seen in the sheer walls. The only opening was so far up that it could not be seen. Sighing deeply and beginning to shiver, Dree trudged back to the nest cave. Her eyes filled with salty tears as she spread her dress out to dry. The skirt was stained in several places, and one of the sleeves was torn at the shoulder. Her slippers were in no better shape. All the work that Mama and Papa had done for her ruined. The feeling of hopelessness returned to overwhelm her senses. Falling to the floor, Dree bitterly sobbed into her knees. "Oh, Mama, Papa," she cried over and over again. Would she ever see them again? Would she see anyone ever again? How dare that thing take her from everyone and everything she loved? How was she going to survive this nightmare? She had to, she thought as she lifted her head. She couldn't let her family die. She couldn't let her home be destroyed. "I'll do whatever I have to," she whispered. "What choice do I have?" Moments later, she heard the beat of oncoming wings and jumped to her feet. Dressing quickly and turning the eggs rather sloppily, she stood quietly waiting when Kansura entered the cave. She was not going to show her fear or her pain, not if she could help it. The beach dropped a basket on the floor and scanned the nest. "Your work is sloppy, girl. Do better," she growled. Looking Dree up and down and sniffing the air, she grunted. "I see you found the water cave." Lowering her head to the basket, she growled the word "eat," and turned and left again. As the beast's tail disappeared through the tunnel, Drianna went to the basket. Reaching toward it, she noticed a dark red stain along one side. Knowing full well that the stain was some poor soul's blood, Drianna felt queasy as she turned it over. Inside were fruits and vegetables, 2 loaves of bread, and a small wheel of cheese. There was a small blanket and 2 napkins as well. Someone's picnic. Although hungry, Dree could not bring herself to eat at the moment. Terrified screams echoed in her head as she thought of those who had died what must have been a horrifying death so she could have food. Her stomach turned and she staggered backwards, leaving the basket where it lay. Crawling to a dark corner, she drew her knees to her chest and cried herself into a restless sleep, sand from the floor sticking to her wet cheeks and hair. Dreams of her home drifted into her mind. Mama Bell's smile, Papa Colin's warm bear hugs, and a small smile passed her lips. Her sleep became one of peace. She hugged her knees in her horrible new home. Chapter 6. By the Wayside. Golden wings danced on the air currents with the grace and precision of a ballerina. Sharp eyes missed nothing as they scanned the view from above. Sensitive ears listened closely for the hoofbeats below. They were too slow. Drianna was far away now. They must hurry. "Hurry! Hurry!" he screamed. Devlin and the other heard the hawk screams from far above, far ahead. Somehow he could understand the bird's frustration. From the beginning, Devlin had watched his 3 companions. Although he had lived in Dolan for a long time, he had rarely visited the village, so he had not gotten to know its inhabitants well. Slowly he watched, listened, and learned. Otto Cash had taken charge from the start. He was boisterous and loud, believing himself right in all things. He was quick-tempered and mean when his orders were not followed right away, and he would bully the brothers into submission every chance he got. Otto's dislike for him was apparent right from the start. Devlin, although quiet, would not bend to Otto's authority and would not be bullied. This bothered Otto to no end. The Oley boys were an odd pair to his point of view. Although nice enough fellows in their own right, it seemed that one could do nothing without the other. They rode, worked, and slept side by side. This worried him, but he did his best to put it out of his mind. Nightfall was approaching fast, so the 4 stopped and set up camp in a small meadow. Otto boasted that he knew of an inn about another day's ride to the north, and that by tomorrow night they would be sleeping in real beds and eating real food. Devlin had to laugh to himself. It had only been a few days, for pity's sake. They rode through beautiful countryside. Forests of trees of every shape and size and color dominated the landscape. Meadows of wild flowers and wild wheat were nestled here and there. They followed the north-south road, which was one of 3 that crisscrossed the valley. The others ran east and west. one to the north and the other to the south. The road was really nothing more than a wagon trail. The land on both sides was wild and raw. The woods were full of game, deer, wild pig, and bear, to name only a few. With a couple of well-aimed stones, they could have roasted rabbit for dinner. The sun was bright all day, and the temperature at night was perfect for sleeping outside. What more could the big guy want? Devlin thought to himself. He shook his head and stared into the fire. He sat and listened as the others talked about their mission and the girl they were sent to save. Man, I hope Dree's still alive. She sure is pretty, Marvin said, shaking his head slowly. Tosh nodded to disagreement and whispered, "She's beautiful," and blushed a soft pink. "How would you know? You can't even look at her without nearly fainting," Marvin teased. Tosh blushed even deeper and punched his brother in the arm. "Shut up, you ain't no better." Otto let out a hoot and slapped his knee. "You two little girly boys wouldn't know what to do with a girl even if she jumped on you. And neither would old pretty boy there," he added, pointing at Devlin. "Now me, I've talked to that girl plenty. But she's a strange one, she is. Don't think she knows what a real man is," he said, thumping himself on the chest. "As a matter of fact, I was trying to show her how good I was with critters when that damn fool mule bit me," he continued. "Near beat the thing to death if Papa hadn't stopped me. But y'all are right on one thing. She sure is a pretty thing," he said, and let out a wolf whistle. The hawk they were following settled in a tree behind them and began complaining loudly, chirping and chattering non-stop. Devlin could sense the bird's agitation. It was upset that they had stopped, and it squawked loudly several times and ruffled its feathers in anger. Standing up slowly, Devlin walked to the tree and spoke softly. "I understand your impatience, my friend. I can't promise you we will save her for you, but we must have our rest." To his amazement, the bird quieted and cocked his head and looked directly into his eyes. After a moment, Talent bent low and uttered one low squawk. Devlin could have sworn he heard the word "friend" in his head. Shaking his head in disbelief, he turned back toward the fire. The other ones had been watching him. "What, you talking to critters now?" Otto laughed. "That chicken don't know nothing. I know where we're going. You just follow me and we'll get that girl back, believe you me. I don't know why that old man told us to follow that thing anyway. It's just an animal. It ain't got no brains." The hawk began to cackle loudly. Devlin thought he heard laughter in all that noise. Turning to look at the bird, he had a sense that it was thinking the same thing he was. "Stupid human," were the words that came to his mind. Otto began to laugh, and the Otto boys joined him. Devlin didn't say a word. Sitting down, he watched the fire again. The following morning arrived with a warm breeze blowing. The sunrise, beautiful in pinks and oranges, went largely unnoticed, except for Devlin, who took a moment to savor the view before riding off behind Otto and the others. They rode hard all that day. Otto was determined to get to the inn in time for dinner. Devlin nearly laughed out loud, and the older boys let out simultaneous moans when they reached their destination. The inn looked more like a shack. One good push would have fallen into a pile of firewood. Two very rough-looking men sat at a table on the front porch. Both were trying to grab a buxom young girl who was trying to serve them large tankards of ale. The place looked unsavory, to say the least. but to Otto it must have looked like heaven because he dismounted and swaggered straight inside. The brothers looked at each other, shrugged, and followed suit. Devlin looked around once more and dropped to the ground with an easy grace. As he walked away, Wind Dancer nickered and stamped her foot, showing her displeasure with the situation. Once inside, Devlin's feeling of foreboding only grew stronger. The place was dark and dismal. A large crumbling fireplace stood in the far wall. The smell of soot and stale ale filled the air. Several rickety tables were placed around the large room. A bar consisting of a rough piece of timber lying over several barrels stood on the left. Two small windows in the right-hand wall were so dirty that light from outside could barely be seen through them. 3 rough-looking characters were playing cards at one of the tables, while a sinister fellow stood at the mantel staring at the fire. His very large companion sat nearby, stuffing his face with stew and chunks of sauerbread. Devlin took all this in while listening to the barkeep, who had appeared through the door behind the bar. Offering his hand, he said, "Olaf Miller's the name. How can I help you, lads?" Otto clasped the man's hand and announced that they would have tankards and a plate. "Gracie!" Miller bellowed. "4 ale and 4 bowls, and hurry up about it." Miller's short, fat frame filled the doorway as he placed the order. He was as greasy and as dirty as the place he owned. As he moved away from the door, his wife could be seen stirring a large pot on a big black stove. Her greasy yellow hair hung to her ample waist, and 2 dirty-faced youngsters sat on the floor at her feet. She made an ugly face at her husband and began slopping the thick stew into bowls. Not bothering to wipe her hands, a woman cuffed one of the little ones on the head and said, "Go get your sister now." The child disappeared out the back door and returned a moment later with the girl that had been out front. "Where you been, girl?" the woman snapped. "Lazing about, most likely," she said without waiting for an answer. "4 tankards out front, and be quick about it." The girl let out a little sigh and filled the mugs. As she lifted the heavy tray to her mother shoved the tray of bowls and bread at her and said gruffly, "Take this with you, and quit dilly-dallying." Balancing both trays the best she could, the girl made her way to the table where the 4 young men sat. She served them with her head hung low and her eyes shyly averted. Otto watched her intently, his eyes devouring every curve. The Oliveri stared unblinking at her ample bosom, made more evident by the dress she wore, which looked to be several sizes too small. Devlin was disgusted by his companion's behavior, averted his eyes as not to embarrass the girl further. As he scanned the room once more, he noticed a small child hidden in the dark corner beside the fireplace. Very thin and dressed in nothing but rags, the child looked to be about 3 or 4 years old. When the boy noticed Devlin watching, he shrank back into the corner. Devlin was about to ask about the boy when Otto grabbed the girl's arm as she turned to leave. "Where you going, sweetie?" he asked. "Stay and talk a minute, will ya?" pulling her closer. "What's your name, honey?" Looking up for the first time, the girl was about to say something nasty when she looked at Otto. The words died in her throat, and she blushed from head to toe. "Addie," she said in a quiet little voice. For the first time in Otto Cash's life, he was at a loss for words as he looked into the young girl's sweet face. All he could do was repeat her name rather stupidly. Trying hard not to laugh, Devlin had to admit Otto had good taste. Addie was a pretty girl. He guessed her to be about 17. She was well built, with long blonde curls tied behind her neck with twine. Her eyes were dusty blue, with long dark lashes. If taken out of this dismal place, she could be quite striking, he thought. A loud commotion from the corner brought everyone's attention around quickly. "Hey, you little rat, what you think you're doing?" The tiny boy lay cowering on the floor, a small piece of bread clutched in his hand. One of the men from the table under the window stood over him, ready to hit him with a meaty fist. Devlin was between them in a split second. He grabbed the man's wrist in a powerful grip and without a word held out his other hand to the boy. Scampering up behind Devlin's leg, the child sat shivering with his eyes closed tightly. "Let me go, boy," the man demanded. "That there critter is a thief and deserves what I'm gonna give him." Devlin held fast to the man's arm. He started to speak when Ole stood and hollered, "Hey, Tomlin, let him be." Otto's words died away as Devlin turned and looked at him. The intensity in his eyes made Otto snap his mouth shut and sit back down quickly. The Ole boys shrank back in their seats and said nothing. Devlin turned back to the man just in time to duck a roundhouse swing from his other fist. Devlin twisted the man's wrist enough to bring a howl of pain from his red face. He twisted a little more, then brought the man to his knees. "What the hell is going on?" Miss Miller came from behind the bar in a rush. Taken in the situation, he launched himself toward Devlin and the boy. The fat man stopped on his toes when he caught sight of Devlin's eyes. Red-faced with anger, he bellowed at the child. "How many times I gotta tell you, boy, stay out of here?" The boy whimpered behind Devlin's legs. "The little one is with me now," Devlin said with deadly calm, not taking his eyes from the man he held. "Please bring another bowl and a tankard of milk to our table." Miller's mouth dropped open and his eyes grew wide. He sputtered something inaudible and started to speak. Now if you please," Devlin said, cutting the man off. Miller turned back toward the bar, muttering words. "Crazy bastard," under his breath. The man Devlin held was still on his knees, his eyes closed tight against the pane. Devlin spoke his words softly, but the meaning of them undeniably harsh. "You will not touch this child, sir. You do, and you die." The look in his eyes made all three men lower their heads and say, "Yes, sir." Devlin released the man's arm and backed away to his table, taking the boy with him. Otto and the others said nothing. They only watched as the boy stuffed the food in his mouth as if it were his last meal. Devlin waited until he had licked the bowl clean and swallowed every last drop of milk before asking the boy his name. The boy looked at him curiously and barked like a dog. The others at the table burst out laughing, which sent the boy ducking under the table. After telling the others to be quiet, Devlin reached under the table and hauled the boy into his lap. "What's your name?" he asked again. The boy only barked again. Addie moved quietly to the table and said, "He can't talk, sir. He showed up here a few months ago. He had never said a word, only barks or grunts or chirps like a bird." She shook her head in pity. "Father says he's crazy." "Crazy or not, he's a child and deserves to be treated better than an animal," Devlin said angrily. Addie took a step back and nodded. "I know, sir. I beat him when Ma and Pa aren't looking." Devlin looked at the girl and smiled slowly. "You're a good person, Addie, and good things will happen for you, I'm sure," he said softly. Addie blushed prettily. and ran off to answer her mother's harsh call. The boy fell asleep in his lap as Devlin finished his own meal. He listened to the others talk about where they were headed and what was to come. Otto, as was his way, boasted about how he would fight the dragon with his bare hands and take her head to hang on the wall of his room. While the brothers looked at him in awe, Devlin only shook his head. In doing so, he noticed the man at the mantel seemed very interested in their conversation. Not wanting any more trouble, he suggested that they should be on their way before nightfall. Otto started to argue, but noticed the man as well. He also noticed the man's huge companion. Not wanting to seem afraid, he said loudly, we're not getting any closer to that dragon sitting here. Let's go, boys. Once outside, the boy mounted quickly and headed north once more. Devin had placed the boy in front of him on Wind Dancer. The child seemed totally delighted with the situation and laughed gleefully as they galloped away. End of chapter 6, end of this reading.